The sprawling, sun-baked concrete arteries of Southern California have long represented the ultimate American promise of freedom and boundless momentum. Yet, as the 1970s bled into a new decade, this vast network of asphalt transformed into an inescapable hunting ground. Beneath the roar of passing engines and the blinding glare of the Pacific sun, a predator was turning the ultimate symbol of mobility into a conveyor belt of death. The freeways were no longer a path to the future, but a dumping ground for the discarded. The grim discoveries began with unsettling regularity along the dusty shoulders and isolated off-ramps of the interstate system. A bruised, lifeless body would be found tangled in the dry brush, stripped of dignity, and left to the unforgiving elements. These were not the scenes of sudden, chaotic violence, but the chilling aftermath of prolonged, calculated torment. The ligature marks told a story of slow, deliberate strangulation, leaving behind silent witnesses etched directly into the flesh of the fallen. The targets were almost exclusively young men and adolescent boys, many of them hitchhikers seeking a simple ride to the beach or a neighboring town. They were the vulnerable, the transient, and the trusting, stepping into passenger seats with the naive belief in the kindness of strangers. This specific victimology was no accident. The predator understood that a missing runaway or a wandering teen might not immediately trigger the massive, coordinated alarm bells reserved for other demographics. The sheer scale of the geography became the killer's greatest weapon against early detection. A young boy might vanish from the neon-lit streets of Hollywood, only to be discovered days later in a desolate ravine in Orange County or the rugged foothills of Riverside. Because the abductions and the dumping grounds occurred in entirely different jurisdictions, the crimes were isolated by invisible municipal borders. Law enforcement agencies were operating in silos, entirely unaware that their local tragedy was merely one piece of a sprawling, regional nightmare. This manipulation of jurisdictional boundaries revealed a terrifyingly organized intelligence behind the wheel. The perpetrator possessed a profound, predatory understanding of bureaucratic limitations. He knew that a detective in Los Angeles was not casually sharing daily field reports with a sheriff's deputy 50 miles south. This calculated geographical dispersal was a masterclass in forensic camouflage, designed specifically to keep the authorities blind to the escalating pattern of his atrocities. For months, dedicated detectives worked tirelessly on their individual cases, chasing down local leads that ultimately went nowhere. They interviewed the friends of the victims, scoured the immediate neighborhoods for witnesses, and combed over the sparse physical evidence recovered from the isolated dump sites. Yet, without the broader context of the other murders, their localized investigations were effectively paralyzed. The vital clues needed to catch a serial killer were scattered across a dozen different evidence lockers in a dozen different cities. In those disparate laboratories, forensic technicians were looking at the exact same signatures of death without realizing it. The specific type of knots used to bind the victims, the unique microscopic fibers transferred from the interior of a customized van, and the distinct pattern of post-mortem indignities were all present. However, forensic taphonomy and trace evidence analysis are only as powerful as the comparative databases available. Without a unified system to cross-reference these findings, the identical fibers remained mute, unable to scream the truth of a single, shared killer. Between 1979 and 1980, the body count quietly, then deafeningly, escalated. Panic began to seep into the collective consciousness of Southern California as the isolated reports in local newspapers slowly began to bleed into the regional broadcasts. Parents started locking their doors tighter, and the once ubiquitous sight of a teenager with an outstretched thumb on the on-ramp became a chilling rarity. The public was beginning to sense the presence of a monster, even if the divided police forces had not yet officially connected the dots. Navigating this climate of growing terror was William Bonin, a man whose unremarkable exterior perfectly concealed the depths of his depravity. A truck driver by trade, he spent his days and nights traversing the very highways that served as his hunting grounds. He drove a customized Ford van, a mobile torture chamber insulated from the outside world, allowing him to blend seamlessly into the endless stream of commercial and recreational traffic. Bonin was the terrifying embodiment of the predator hiding in plain sight. The banality of his daily existence stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the sadistic urges that drove him. Bonin exhibited a severe, malignant psychopathy, completely devoid of empathy for the lives he snuffed out or the families he destroyed. To him, the young hitchhikers were not human beings with futures and loved ones, but mere objects of gratification to be used and discarded. His ability to compartmentalize his monstrous acts allowed him to smile at gas station attendants while a nightmare unfolded just behind the driver's seat. Complicating the investigative landscape even further was the shocking reality that he rarely operated alone. Bonin frequently employed a rotating cast of accomplices, individuals drawn into his dark orbit by a toxic mixture of manipulation, shared deviance, and fear. This introduction of multiple perpetrators fundamentally skewed the early behavioral profiles generated by law enforcement. Witnesses who caught fleeting glimpses of the abductions reported different physical descriptions, leading detectives to hunt for multiple unconnected suspects rather than a single coordinated ring of killers. The sheer volume of unrelated missing persons reports in a transient hub like Southern California acted as a thick fog over the investigation. Thousands of youths ran away to the West Coast every year, creating a daunting haystack in which to find the needle of a serial killer's victims. Detectives were forced to sift through endless administrative noise, trying to determine which disappearances were tragic teenage rebellions and which were the work of the phantom haunting the interstate system. The turning point required a fundamental shift in perspective, a moment where a single investigator looked beyond the boundaries of their own precinct. It began with the quiet realization that the ligature marks and the specific, brutal methodology found on a body in Los Angeles perfectly mirrored a cold case file from neighboring Orange County. This crucial observation pierced the veil of jurisdictional isolation. The realization dawned, heavy and terrifying, that the isolated murders were, in fact, the work of a highly prolific, highly mobile serial killer. Recognizing the magnitude of the threat, the fragmented law enforcement agencies finally began to dismantle the walls that separated them. A multi-agency task force was hastily assembled, bringing together homicide detectives, forensic specialists, and highway patrolmen into a single, unified command center. Information that had been hoarded in local filing cabinets was suddenly spread across massive corkboards. For the first time, the investigators could see the sprawling, bloody map of the killer's reign, tracking the terrifying frequency of his strikes. With the cases officially linked, the previously mute physical evidence began to speak with a deafening roar. The microscopic fibers found on victims miles apart were finally matched, confirming they originated from the exact same vehicle interior. The specific, complex knots used to bind the young men were analyzed by experts, revealing a distinct modus operandi that served as a psychological fingerprint. The silent witnesses of the crime scenes were finally allowed to testify in unison, pointing definitively toward a single, terrifying source. The consolidation of the investigation birthed a terrifying new reality for the public, crystallized by the media's adoption of a chilling moniker. The Freeway Killer was no longer a localized rumor, but an officially recognized regional menace that dominated the evening news. The sprawling concrete infrastructure of Southern California was permanently tainted, transformed in the public imagination from a marvel of modern engineering into a labyrinth of lethal peril. The innocence of the open road was shattered, replaced by a pervasive, suffocating dread. As the task force tightened its grip and the media coverage reached a fever pitch, the arrogance of the predator began to show fractures. Serial killers often derive a twisted sense of omnipotence from their ability to evade capture, believing themselves intellectually superior to the authorities hunting them. However, the sudden coordinated pressure disrupted this delusion of invincibility. The psychological strain of being actively hunted forces mistakes, pushing a calculated killer into impulsive, reckless behavior that ultimately leads to their downfall. The final acts of violence lacked the meticulous geographical distancing of the earlier murders. The desperate need to kill overpowered the disciplined methodology that had kept the perpetrator hidden for so long. Bodies were discarded with less care, left in locations that were more visible and closer to the areas of abduction. The meticulous forensic camouflage was slipping, leaving behind fresh, glaring evidence that the newly formed task force was perfectly positioned to exploit. The reign of terror did not end with a dramatic cinematic shootout, but with the mundane reality of proactive police work. A routine patrol unit spotted a customized van matching the newly distributed suspect profile, driving erratically in Hollywood. The officers initiated a traffic stop, unaware in that fleeting moment that they were about to pull over the architect of one of the most horrific killing sprees in California history. It was a simple twist of fate that finally severed the killer's connection to the freeways. When William Bonin was finally pulled from the driver's seat, the arresting officers were struck by the profound ordinariness of the man. There were no outward signs of the monster within, no physical manifestation of the immense suffering he had caused. He was simply a heavy-set truck driver with a mild demeanor, a terrifying testament to the fact that the most dangerous predators do not lurk in the shadows, but walk comfortably in the daylight. The walls of silence surrounding the crimes rapidly collapsed once Bonin was in custody. Faced with the overwhelming weight of the newly unified forensic evidence, the fragile alliances between the killer and his accomplices shattered. The co-conspirators, desperate to save themselves from the executioner's needle, began to confess, providing detectives with a horrifying, detailed account of the abductions and the torture. The full, staggering scope of the Freeway Killer's crimes was finally dragged into the harsh light of the interrogation room. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a devastating finality that offered no true solace. Decades of agonizing uncertainty, of staring at the telephone and hoping for a miracle, were abruptly replaced by the brutal reality of the autopsy reports. They were forced to confront the unimaginable terror their sons and brothers had endured in the final hours of their lives. The apprehension of the killer could not undo the profound generational trauma inflicted upon those left behind to mourn. The legacy of the 1979 to 1980 killing spree fundamentally altered the cultural landscape of Southern California. The carefree era of hitchhiking was effectively eradicated, replaced by a deep-seated suspicion of strangers that persists to this day. The very concept of the freeway, once a symbol of endless possibility, was forever scarred by the memory of the young lives stolen along its shoulders. The psychological infrastructure of the region was permanently changed, hardened by the realization of the evil that could cruise its highways unnoticed. Even with the perpetrator behind bars, a haunting question lingered in the minds of the investigators and the public alike. How many lives could have been saved if the invisible walls of jurisdiction had been torn down sooner? The tragic reality is that the killer's success was heavily subsidized by the systemic failure of separate police departments to communicate. The early victims were not just casualties of a psychopathic predator, but of a fragmented law enforcement apparatus that was ill-equipped to handle a highly mobile threat. The blood spilled by William Bonin ultimately forced a revolution in how serial crimes are investigated. The catastrophic delays in linking his murders directly catalyzed the development of centralized, computerized databases and mandated interagency cooperation protocols. Modern forensic networks and regional task forces stand as monuments to the lives lost on those sun-baked asphalt arteries. The silent witnesses of the past finally ensured that the sprawling borders of the freeways could never again be used to hide a monster in plain sight.